Hi, awesome members of the Nest on Words and Whimsy. Thank you for being here. You could be anywhere else, but you chose to be here with us. And tonight we're talking to Cara Thomas, who is the author of Out of the Ashes. How's it going?
Good. It's so good to see you guys again. Thank you for having me.
So excited to have you back. So
Yeah.
for those of our viewers who aren't familiar with you and your work, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. So if you have read my books before, I am the author of 7 books for young adults, and they are all mysteries and thrillers. Most recently, there was That Weekend. Probably my most popular book is called The Cheerleaders. And Out of the Ashes is my first book for adults.
So excited. I remember, when we chatted for That Weekend almost 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And you talked about that you're working on your first adult book, and it was like, yes, now we're here.
I'm glad you didn't have to wait too long.
It didn't feel like it was that long.
Good. I absolutely loved it. It was so good. I can't wait for everybody to experience it because I was lost the entire time and just so wrapped up in it. I loved it.
Should I tell everybody what it's about? I feel like I didn't do like the elevator pitch.
We would love that. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So Out of the Ashes, my first book for adults, is about a woman named Samantha who, when she was 13 years old, she was sleeping over a friend's house. And while she was at a friend's house, her entire family was murdered, and the murderers set her house on fire with the bodies of her parents, her uncle, and her baby sister inside. And decades later, she's left her small hometown of Kearney, upstate New York. She's working as a ICU nurse in Queens when she has to go back home when a surviving family member dies. And after he says something cryptic to her on his deathbed, Samantha learns that a new witness has come forward 20 years later who claims that he saw a man carrying her baby sister out of the house the night of the fire before the fire was set.
And then events transpire, all kinds of events.
Yes, so very many events.
It is so good. That's all I can say because I can't spoil it, but it was so good. So when did you find your passion for writing? Tell us about that.
I feel like I just always kind of had it. I am an only child. My parents were a little older when they had me, so a lot of my childhood was finding ways to entertain myself. If you don't, for any of you out there who don't have siblings, you know. And for me, that it started with a love of reading, and I think just like storytelling, whatever ways I could, like acting out scenarios like with my dolls and like forming all these like relationships they had in their head. And it was really just like using my imagination at a young age because I really just had myself. So I think it like started to develop into a love for writing when I really just like discovered mystery novels at a young age, like the Nancy Drew series, Hardy Boys, Boxcar Children. Like I loved all that shit. And I was probably around like 7 or 8 when I just dabbled in writing like my own mystery, which was like just the Nancy Drew characters renamed. Like if I'm sitting there in like 4th grade math class writing my first novel, and my teacher is like, "What do you think you're doing?" And so, yeah, I got in trouble for that. Was still like never recovered math wise, but I still awful at math. Always was my worst subject. But I discovered that I really just liked making stuff up. And yeah, I mean, it never, not to like tread on your next question, if you were going to ask like how like that passion actually like became a career, but I never really thought that that writing could like be a viable career until I was in college. It was always just like something that I did for fun. And like I would look around and see these like published authors, and it was almost like they weren't even like real people to me. It's like that wasn't really something that like happened to normal people. It's not like, oh, you just like write a book and like you can get it published. It was like I don't know, like Stephen King was just like spawned from the earth with all these books, and he's just like was this like entity. Yeah, so it definitely started really early for me, but I mean, before the love of writing, I was a reader first.
I love that. You can't become a writer without being a reader.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did you, and I feel like we maybe had talked about this last time you were here, so sorry if this is a repeat, but I feel like I didn't remember that you also work in a library part-time. Has that always what you have done besides writing, or were there other jobs that you've had?
So that's actually a recent thing. I started my job at the library last year. I started my master's degree in library and information science back in, I applied to go to library school in 2016. I don't know if anybody remembers the faraway time of 2016, but it was like a very tumultuous time in the world. I was struggling through revisions for my book Little Monsters, and I had another book contracted with my publisher for young adults, but I just went through this like crisis. Like, am I really going to be doing this for the next 20, 25 years until I can retire and do whatever the hell I want? It was writing was paying the bills, but I was just like so deeply unhappy with not having an outlet outside of writing. It was like, I'm writing this book, I'm revising this book, it's making me miserable. I'm on my fourth draft and I'm like going to bed every night and I'm waking up and I'm still miserable and I don't have anything else. And it was actually my therapist that was like, have you considered like the fact that you have a college degree and maybe you could do something else? So I started like thinking about what else I would like to do, because like it kind of like freaked me the fuck out. I'm 26 years old and I'm like, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. Like all I've ever done is write. And I just remember that like in one of like my meltdowns, like trying to figure out like, what am I going to do with my life if my book gives me a mental breakdown and I just can't do this anymore? And like, I went to my local library to kind of just like try to get some work done and like relax. And I remember looking around, I was like, those librarians look so calm and chill and happy, and they are such a comforting presence. And then like I went home and I talked to like a couple friends of mine who actually like went and got their master's degree in library science, and they were like, oh yeah, it's a great job, like why don't you do that? So I started library school officially in 2017, and I was like very, very slowly working towards the degree. I wasn't in any sort of rush. And then like, I mean, my husband and I had our first child. I had that weekend coming out. And then it wasn't like really until the pandemic that, again, writing was like, oh my God, I'm so sick of being in my head all day. I'm sick of being in the house all day. Like maybe I need to speed up my degree and see if I actually like working in a library. And I absolutely love it. I mean, anybody that loves books, you get to be around books all day. I mean, that's just like, it's actually a very small part of the job, the book part. It's a lot of people and one-on-one and interaction. But I found that like going back to work in a public place and dealing with strangers on a daily basis, a lot of strangers, some of them super weird. It was like helping me kind of like refill that creative well that had been empty the past few years from like just being by myself and writing.
I feel that. I feel like you need to have those like experience. Sorry, Jess.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Those experiences out in the world, of course, to get some inspiration from sometimes. Otherwise, it's just like.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it can be as simple as like, God, like what do people sound like when they have a conversation? It's like, because I've only had a conversation with like the same 3 people for the past year. So yeah, it's definitely important. Like when people ask, they're like, well, how do I become a better writer? How do I write more realistic dialogue? I'm just like, go hang out with your friends in a public place, honestly. Like, I mean, read a lot, practice writing, but also just like get out of your head and get out there and listen and observe people.
That is so fascinating that it was just I got to do something to get out of my own head. And then you became a librarian. You pursued a whole degree just to.
And I get to do so many arts and crafts, which is awesome.
That is always a plus side.
Okay, but can you tell us more about what the classes are like to become a librarian?
Oh, I've looked into this. I do want to hear her.
Okay, all right. So like I'm not gonna name what school I went to, even though like you can probably Google it. Like it's a lot of the same freaking class. It's like this is how things happen in a library. Why don't you write a paper about what it might be like to work in a library? Like it's honestly crazy. Like there's stuff about like knowledge organization and technologies and like collection development, but it's one of those degrees where it's like you don't learn anything until you're actually on the job, like working in the role, hands on. And I mean, I think maybe part of that was that a large portion of my schooling and my master's degree was like during lockdown. So everything was on Zoom and like Blackboard anyway. But yeah, there are like, so one of the coolest classes I did get to take was young adult fiction. And it was awesome because like obviously like nobody knew who I was on Blackboard. Like nobody's like logging on to Blackboard and like recognizing the name Kara Thomas and being like, oh yeah, like the world renowned author. So I got to just like act like I knew what I was talking about in the discussion board about like the state of YA literature. And I'm like, you know, I got this. Like I spend time on YA Twitter. Like I'll tell you.
You have to present and you're like, I read this phenomenal author, Kara Thomas.
We share the same name, but
so weird that her author photo on the back of this book is me. Like, this is a presentation, not a plug. So speaking of Twitter and social media, your bio says that you spend too much time on Reddit Unsolved Mysteries. And a lot of the mod team is very into learning about cold cases as well. Do you have any that particularly intrigue you?
Okay, so I kind of have a rotation, and I know this is going to make me sound like an absolute lunatic, but like hear me out. I have a rotation of like missing persons cases that I just kind of like Google and check in on to see if like anything has happened and just like it's a running tally of updates. And I realized that like as I was doing that, there's like a whole community of people doing this on Reddit, Unresolved Mysteries. So that's kind of like how I fell into that rabbit hole. But one of the cases that like I just regularly check in on is he was a scuba diver and his name is Ben McDaniel, and he liked to cave scuba dive, and he went to like this, like it's exactly what it sounds like, terrifying, like underwater caves in like either man-made reservoirs or natural reservoirs, but his belongings were found like on the shore where he entered the water, and they found like his oxygen tank like deep in the cave, and they had like several professional divers like go in and check all of the crevices, and like this guy Ben, the one who like went into the water and never came out, he was a really big guy, so it's not like he's like that big and snuck into a corner and it's like, oops, the fish ate him and they never found him. Like it just makes no sense that he would go into such a small space and never come out. So then it's like, was it staged to make it look like he went into the water? Like, did somebody like murder him and leave all of his stuff as like a red herring? So that I think is like the type of case that really just like activates my really bad OCD, where I'm like, I gotta know everything about this. And if I don't get answers about this, it's just going to like drive me crazy. And it's like, if when you feel like that as just like an observer, it's like, God, I can't imagine like how these people's families must feel. Like it's terrible because it's just like all of those like pieces of the puzzle that just like fascinate us. Like it's just, it's really disturbing when you think about it.
Yeah. I just Googled and you were right. He is not the kind of guy that could just get in a corner. He's a big guy.
Yeah. And these are like the type of diving that he was doing. Like you have to be a really skilled advanced level of scuba diver to be able to like navigate those dark caves. So like it also just like pings all sort of like claustrophobia buttons and like fear of like deep water buttons. Yeah, it's actually it's a very disturbing and terrifying case.
Yeah, I feel like especially with a lot of the ones that are like the missing person cases, it's just like there's a chance it could never be solved, or it could be solved either from, like a deathbed confession or like all of these things. And it's just like terrifying.
Yeah, that actually is what inspired Out of the Ashes. There was another like missing persons case that when you said like it might never be solved, like just like going back like decades and decades. So I used to be like extremely obsessed with this show called Disappeared on ID Discovery. That's like about
Mhm.
exactly what it sounds. It's about missing persons. And I first heard of this case about these two girls who were kidnapped from a home before like the parents were murdered and the house was set on fire, and they never found the girls. And that kind of sent me down the rabbit hole of like people that had gone missing after house fires. And I came upon another case back from 1945. This family with like 8 children. There was like a tragic house fire on Christmas Eve that they couldn't quite determine if it was arson or not, set on purpose. But like some of the family survived. The parents were killed. They found their bodies, but 5 children were never recovered from the house and were never seen again. And that just like it like makes your skin crawl to think of that. And like the logical explanation is it's 1945. They don't have the forensic technology to detect remains of small children that maybe were like in the basement of the house, and the house collapsed and the fire burned really, really hot. But then there's also like the possibility, like, were they taken out of the house before the house was set on fire? And it's like the saddest thing is like that family was never going to get answers. Like I think like the oldest surviving sibling of the house fire like died a few years ago or something. And it's just like, even if that case is definitively solved one day, like there's not going to be any closure for the family because they're all gone. And that's kind of like the rabbit hole that I went down when I came up with like this character of Samantha. It's like somebody that like wakes up every morning and thinks like, is another 20 years going to go by before I find out like who killed my family and what happened to my sister?
Mhm.
That just got super dark really fast.
I'm so heavy, but a lot of Out of the Ashes is kind of like clicking into place now of where it came from and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry if I keep my cough is mostly under control unless I start laughing, apparently, and then I start coughing. So sorry.
I'll stop being funny. I'll talk
Yeah, how
more
dare you.
about. I'll talk more
us more
about
about
horrific murder arsons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, your book is not particularly funny, and that's okay.
I don't know. Samantha's hilarious to me.
Yeah.
I feel like this time I needed for a book with subject matter this dark, that like the main character really just needed to have a dark sense of humor to prevent the book from being too heavy, because like she was bringing like a little bit of a humorous perspective to things. Like yeah, I just thought without her worldview being like, well, fuck it, that it might just it could be too dark of a reading experience for people, which does happen with some mysteries and thrillers. It's like, oh my God, this is hideously depressing. Why am I reading this? Like, this main character sounds like they want to die, so I don't really care if they die.
Sam was just so fun. She was sarcastic and witty, and she was relentless, and she was just such a fun main character.
Oh, thank you.
Speaking of, so yeah, let's get into the book. So first of all, so Out of the Ashes comes out on Monday, which we are also excited about which we'll get into. Well, I might as well start now. Okay, so you were saying before the chat started that Out of the Ashes was an Amazon First Reads book for, was it this month?
Yes, for April. Yep.
Which is awesome. Congrats. Like, how did you find out about that happening?
My editor gave me like a pretty like big heads up that was happening. Like I would say like probably last fall or last summer, she called to let me know that it was chosen. And she told me like, this is going to like completely like reconfigure how you view a release date, because I mean the book like officially comes out May 1st, but starting April 1st, people, Amazon Prime members, and then anybody else who like reads on Kindle would be able to download the book for the entire month of April. So even though like the paperback and the audiobook will not ship until Monday, the official release date, the ebook has been accessible to anybody that wants it for the past month. So a lot of people have already read it. So that is just like a very, very different experience from my previous books, where it's like they send out like a bunch of advanced reader copies, like the reviews start to trickle in, and like release day is like this whole like big hyped up thing where it's like, oh my God, anybody can get it now. So it was different this time around. And I think it was pretty cool. I think it was actually like took some of like the pressure off of that like release day thing.
But then you do get to actually celebrate in person again, which you haven't for at least your last book. What are your big plans?
So I am having my first in-person book launch since the cheerleaders in 2018. It will be on May 18th at 7 p.m. at the Next Chapter in Huntington, New York, which is a independent bookstore on Long Island. For anybody who is listening that is on Long Island, you may have been familiar with the Book Review. Book Review was the biggest independent bookstore on Long Island. It was a fantastic, wonderful store. Unfortunately, they were a casualty of COVID, but the Next Chapter took over, bought out the business. And for the past few years, they've been like slowly starting to do in-person events again. And I'm very excited to be one of them. It's just going to be really fun to actually like see the readers again. I only released one book like at the height of COVID that weekend in 2021. So I've only had like one virtual launch. And it was fun, like being in conversation with my good friend Erin Craig, and we had a great time talking. But it's just such a different experience when you don't get to like see how people in the crowd are reacting to what you're saying. It kind of just like fuels you to talk about the book more when you can see that people are like actually interested in what you're saying about it, and it's not just like standing on like a podium, just like speaking into the void.
Yeah, we talked a little before the chat about that whole, it's amazing to get that actual engagement and be able to interact with people who genuinely are as excited about your book as you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And wine, people who are excited about wine. That's how I'm bribing all my friends to come. Like I'm bringing like 10 bottles of wine, bitches. You better be there. Get a babysitter.
Perfect. We would be there if we were closer.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, like you mentioned, Out of the Ashes is your first adult novel. Was making the transition from YA to adult difficult for you, and how did you approach it?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of time to think about this question, because like I knew I would get this question. This book was honestly, like full disclosure, the easiest book I have written in years in terms of like not having to overthink it. And I was trying to like pinpoint why that was. And I think like at the time, like writing that weekend was just like a very difficult experience from start to finish. Like I was pregnant when I was drafting it. And then when I had to rewrite the book, like I had a newborn baby. And then once I finally like was able to write again, like my brain swelling went down after having a baby. Like there were just like difficult conversations with my editor about like the perspective. It's like, does this need to be like a dual perspective book? Like there were just so many questions about how the story was told. And a lot of that, I felt like just finding like the emotional center and in the perspective and the narration was like, I am like a 30-something-year-old woman and I'm still writing about teenagers, and there's like nothing bad about that. I'm just so far removed from that experience that I'm having so much trouble getting into this character's head. And I didn't really like know what the solution was for that. I was like, maybe I just like need a break from writing YA. Maybe I've written too many YA novels in a short period of time. And I'm getting to the point where like I've gone as far as I could go in the genre. Like I've pushed all the boundaries I could push. And like, if you've read That Weekend, you know what I'm talking about. Like people were mad and not everybody liked it. And I was like, okay, maybe this is like a really good time to explore writing for adults. And I think like a lot of people, like we know that YA as a category has its naysayers. There are like all of those like clickbaity headlines that's like, if you're an adult that reads YA, you should be embarrassed of yourself and stuff. Like everybody has been down that road before. Like they've had that discussion in the book communities. And it's like, as a YA author, you kind of feel like preemptively defensive when people suggest that like YA novels are not as sophisticated as book for adults. And like, we all know that that's some bullshit because like I've read some really like brilliant, high quality literary YA novels. And then like a really hyped up like lead title from an adult publisher that's like, what were you guys thinking? This is absolutely terrible. So I wasn't really like too hung up on all that baggage, like going into it. It's like, oh, like I'm writing for adults now. Like this needs to be like more serious and better. It was kind of just like, okay, I don't have as many rules to follow now because like when you're writing for teens, it is so much more challenging in so many ways. Like, I mean, I'm not talking about like, you can't do this or you can't do that because I mean, if you guys have read my books, you know that like I don't really subscribe to like you can't do certain things or address certain topics in YA. Like I really think that anything goes in YA. It's a matter of how you handle it. Is it believable? Is this something that is going to resonate with teenagers? And the biggest problem I encountered, and I think like any YA mystery or thriller writer, is like teenagers these days, they go to school. Not all of them have driver's licenses. A lot of them are worried about getting into college. They have part-time jobs. They have parents. It's like they're not solving murders on the weekend. So it's just like a tough sell as a premise when you're going into like a YA thriller. It's like, how do I make this believable and compelling and still hit like all of like the requirements of like the whodunit that like the character has to be actively like investigating and trying to like put things together. So that is just like that's very challenging logistically to make it ring true. And like there's only so many times that you can like set a YA novel over the summer so you don't have to deal with like the inconvenience of the kids having to go to school. So like writing Out of the Ashes, it was like, wow, I am writing a fully autonomous human being for the first time that does not have a curfew, that has a car that can like do whatever the hell she wants. And that just like freed up so much brain space for me to just like bang out the draft and dig into like the other aspects of the story without having to focus on like, is this ringing true? Or do I feel like somebody who is just writing a mystery and the characters just so happen to be teens because I've been pigeonholed as a YA writer. So it didn't feel more difficult for me at the time. Now when I'm revising my second novel for adults, it's like, oh my God, send me back to high school. Like this is hard.
I did love that Sam had to, take a leave from work though.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was important to me to be like, now that I have like an adult grown-up job where you're like expected to be somewhere, it's like, yep, I'm gonna use that paid time off to go solve a cold case.
So no worrying about school, but definitely gotta put in that PTO request.
Yeah, that is true.
I loved it. It was funny.
Yeah, it's like a huge pet peeve of mine in like adult mysteries and thrillers where like the main character is just like constantly blowing off work to go solve a mystery and there's like no consequences for it. Like maybe in like some work environments where you don't have a supervisor breathing down your neck, you can get away with that. But like I think it's almost like as annoying and unrealistic as the idea that like teenagers are able to like have all this time to solve crime.
Right.
I also had to pull up because I saw on your Instagram a while ago your mom texting you about reading the book and saying, "Sexy scene in your book," like wide eye emoji.
There's an
First of
apology
all,
at the beginning.
first of all, like, I mean, you guys have read the book. Like, yes, it is a sex scene, but to call that scene sexy, it's like,
It
are
was
you
a little
okay?
sexy.
Are you okay, mom? It's like it's kind of like awkward, and I don't know. I wouldn't like it's sexy to them, but it's like not. It's not an aspirational sex scene. Like, oh, it's so hot. It's like there are
You're here, I'm
doors. There's
here.
a tree there. Like, this is just like got to go for it right now. Got to make it happen. But yeah, when my mother sent me that text, I literally like wanted to go into witness protection. I think my follow up to her was like, please do not read it to my father, because like I could see my mother sitting there next to my father in bed, like, you'll never guess what your little girl wrote about, and like read it out, and then he'd be like, that Marianne, stop it. And then like I'd get a long text message from him about like how disappointed he is. But yeah, that is a big difference between writing for teens and adults. Like, you can describe things on the page, like you can give terms and names to what is happening and not just have to fade to black.
You can just start like redacting those pages from your mom's copy.
I think I am going to have to, like, anything I don't want to like discuss with her or hear from her. It's like, oh, I don't know why that page is missing. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe it's a printing error.
I did not go through and Sharpie out parts of your book.
It's a printing error.
Well, so Samantha, the main character, had some serious trauma early on in her life. Was it hard to write a character that suffered so much damage?
Yeah, there were I mean, going in, like, I didn't think it was going to be hard writing about like her particular situation, like losing her family. I was like very far removed from that. But like when I really started to get into certain aspects of the story, like I think it actually like helped my perspective, like being a mother of a small child while I was writing the story, and like tapping into like my biggest fear after having my child was losing my child. And that's not necessarily like Samantha's fear, because she doesn't have a child, but she has lost a sister. She's lost her parents. And like on the way of trying to unravel what happens, you really get a lot of her own mother's anxieties coming out, and her cousin who has a small child. So tapping into like my own terror of like, what if my own child was missing and I never had this answer. I think it helped me dig into Samantha's character more, and like how why she was so willing to go to the lengths that she did, because the idea of like becoming an old lady someday and dying and not knowing what happened to her family was just like so unacceptable. So some of those scenes like were difficult to write, just because I put myself like in her headspace. I spent a lot of time like researching and like reading interviews and long form pieces, like from the point of view of family members who were survivors of trauma and who had lost family members, like whether to like unsolved murders or their loved ones had gone missing, and they just didn't have answers, and like the psychological and emotional toll on them. You can't help but like wonder, like, what if that was my child? Like, what would I do if I lost my child and I did not have answers about what happened to my child for like however many years? And like I never really used to be as affected by that, like before I had a kid of my own. But like I remember, like I guess like a year and a half ago, like I was drafting Out of the Ashes, and like the new Unsolved Mysteries dropped on Netflix. And there was an episode about these two-year-old boys that were taken from a Brooklyn playground and never found. And this was like 30 years ago. And just like why I had to turn it off halfway through. Like I just like emotionally could not handle that topic, where in the past I was like, it was entertainment for me. And it's like you realize like how messed up that is to be like entertained by this stuff, and it's not like entertainment per se. It's just kind of like these like mental gymnastics of trying to like put yourself like in that person's shoes and like imagining like how you would deal with it, and like that's a lot of the process of writing, I think. So yeah, that was a real like womp womp bummer, writing a lot of those scenes.
That had to have been so difficult to kind of engross yourself with all of that horrible, dark stuff and the research to write Samantha's character.
Yeah, it I think most of my books have that like emotional effect on me, because like I write about some like pretty like terrible shit and put my characters through some awful things. I'm gonna be super awkward and grab my allergy eye drops.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I got a cat hair in my eye,
Uh-oh.
and it's like gonna be all over if I don't address this. So anyway, like writing dark stuff, like what it does to you. Yeah. I think for me, like the biggest thing is that if I'm going to be like writing something that dark, the rest of my life kind of has to like be okay. Because there is nothing worse than trying to like, if you're in a bad like mental place, which like I mean I have been at various points like over my writing career. Like I'm a person with emotions, and I've like had low points, and I mentioned like one of them was when I was rewriting Little Monsters for the 50,000th time. Like I like it came up in therapy, but like yeah, it really doesn't help when you like feel shitty and everything around you feels shitty, and you're writing about like a 12-year-old like getting a knife and like stabbing her sister's like older best friend, and like how awful it is. And like getting into the mindset. So I find that there is like more balance, and I have more of a capacity for like writing that dark stuff when everything else in my life is like not like perfect, but when I'm like more motivated to do things that like make me happier. I'm really into my hobbies. Most people like when they hear what my hobbies are, if they really like only know me from my books, they're like, really? Like like you living like little cottage core life over there, like playing Stardew Valley and baking and gardening, and meanwhile you're like writing about homicide and other things that I won't mention because they're super spoilery.
Well, you did post some macarons for your birthday that looked delicious.
That is like the one. I'm not the best baker, but macarons are like the thing that I've mastered just because I was like so
And they're not
committed.
easy either.
Yeah, they're tough. And I think that is like my personality, that if like something is hard and I screw it up 5 times, like I'm not going to be able to move on from it until I get it right. And like that is me in the macarons. And like I kind of reached the point where the macarons, and I'm like, you know what? I perfected them. They're really pretty, but they kind of taste like shit unless you have a really, really good filling. Like the shell, it's like all of that for this.
Yeah.
They photograph quite nicely.
They do. They're gorgeous. So back to the depressing for a minute. I'm so sorry. Gil wrecked us. Me in particular. He destroyed me. Totally wrecked me. What drew you to the storyline between him and Samantha?
So I knew that Samantha had to have a super compelling reason to go back to this place that she absolutely hated. And she obviously does not have the best relationship with her biological family. So, for those who have not read the book, Gil is Samantha's dead mother's foster brother. So they're not like blood siblings, but for her entire life, she's only ever known him as her uncle. Like she has never like questioned like, oh, he's not my mom's like real brother. And he is the one that she actually maintained a relationship with like after she left her hometown. So I knew that she would only go back for him. And I don't think it's spoilery to say in the first chapter that she goes back because Gil is dying. And I always the story went through like so many iterations, like so many different drafts, but that opening with Gil was like the one that it was like the first thing that popped into my mind when I started drafting this book. Like I knew I needed that scene because like the decision that Samantha makes at the end of the first chapter, it's like that kind of tells the reader all they need to know about her and like why she would do that for somebody that she loved. It was like never really a question for her. So Gil was, I forgot like your original question. I feel like I kind of went on a tangent there. I know we're talking about him. Like, where did he come from?
Just
maybe?
what drew you to the storyline between
Yeah.
him and Samantha?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, the book is about like the family that Samantha has lost. And like she has obviously like lost her parents. She did lose a biological uncle the night of the murder because her mom's younger brother lived with them in like a guest house out back. She lost her sister. So Gil is like her last remaining connection to Carney. She has her father's sister and her cousin who she is estranged from, which is like a big part and plot line in the book. But I really needed something that was just going to, I mean, his character was always just like very clear to me because he feels as guilty as Samantha does about just like the way things went down, like how they have like failed each other over the years and like really couldn't be the family that each other needed because of their trauma. But I needed a compelling reason for Samantha to go back to this place she hated. And it also had to be something that just like completely gutted her, like somebody she cared about, like this other loss that set everything else in motion. Just from like a technical standpoint, I think there is nothing more important than starting your story in the right place. Like whenever I read like drafts, whether it's like for friends or like maybe like from an aspiring writer and like they won like a 3-chapter critique, like the biggest problem I always see is that people don't start the story in the right place. Like either they've glossed over too much because they're afraid of having too much exposition, or it's just not necessarily exposition, but it's just they're not starting where they need to start. There's like fat that could be cut, or like, I mean, I always like, I'm like, oh, the inciting incident. And it's like 8th grade ELA term, but that's actually like what it actually means. It's like you need that moment that sets everything in motion for the story to feel believable. And like, especially when you're writing mysteries and you're dealing with cold cases, like, all right, this homicide has been unsolved for 20 years. Like, why now are we diving back in? Like, what happened? And I thought a lot about like Gil's purpose in the story. I didn't think it was a really like emotionally compelling start to the story if you just have this like nurse in Queens who's just like living her life and trying to move on from her trauma, and like some cop calls her up and it's like, hey, there was a witness in your family's murder from 20 years ago. Like it's not necessarily like a bad setup, but for me it lacked that emotional setup to make us really like see how the lack of answers has impacted like not just her but like other people in this family's orbit, like through the mother's foster brother.
Yeah, and then so Kearney is like a pretty small town, I gathered from from the book. What do you think it is about small towns and like secrets that are just so like alluring to write about and read about?
Personally, I love them because I just like the drama that arises from when you have a tight knit community and it's like, oh, we're like this tight knit community. And it's like, maybe you're a little too tight knit because you have all of these like relationships between families, like who from this prominent family is having an affair with this person from this prominent family. And it's like, it's almost like mythology and like lore that goes back decades. And I think it's just like such a compelling setup for a mystery. I mean, like, I think the reason that everybody's like losing their minds over like the Murdoch murders and stuff, it's like, it's just decades of history and trying to like piece together like how all of these people and like families in particular, when people like stay in one place and they like put these roots in these communities, like how it really can just like go so terribly wrong over decades. Like the power and the influence that people wield. Like, I mean, I had like written a draft of Out of the Ashes before all the stuff with the Murdoch like hit the news, before the murders had happened, but it was kind of like along the same train of thought where like Samantha's father worked for this family, the Ely's, who own the farm in town, and they are like a giant farm. They are like the biggest employer in the town. They are the town. They basically control the town. But it's the same thing where like the small town mentality, it's like almost cult like in a way that like if you're not like with them, you're against them. And I wanted to really just like dig into that because I think it's just like rife for all sorts of conspiracies. Like who's protecting who in this town? Like who's like the keeper of the secrets? Like, yeah.
Is Carney based on a real small town or just completely fictional?
Probably like a amalgamation. I don't even know if I pronounced that because it's past my bedtime. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it is. I had visited so many places like that growing up, like visiting family, visiting actually like my father's best friend in Pennsylvania. Like his family had like a summer house and like they were there for decades. My father's best friend very loosely inspired the character of Gil. I'm only saying that because I know he will never stumble upon this and I have a lot to answer for. But so there was that aspect of like this tiny town in Pennsylvania where I had spent so much time growing up that my parents eventually moved to in 2015. So like the more time I spent there, like visiting my parents, it wasn't like necessarily inspired by that town, but more so like the atmosphere, the small town drama that like my father immediately inserted himself in because that's just who he is. He's like, I'm going to move from New York and I'm going to take over your HOA and like make it a big old shit show of like all of you fighting in this like small little town. And it's like, meanwhile, I'm like taking notes and I'm like, this is how they behave in like tiny small town America. So it is completely fictional, but pieces of it come from real places.
Well, you wrote it amazingly well because it felt so true to that whole small town vibe.
Oh, thank you.
So we're going to touch again on some more dark stuff. The commentary on substance abuse is very timely, to say the least. How did you research that part of the story?
I read a lot of nonfiction. I read Dope Sick. I read Dreamland by Sam Quinones. It was mostly reading like books about people who had done like such exhaustive research, but also had painted like very vivid portraits of real people that were suffering from addiction and like seeing how it impacted their families. And I mean, even though like I don't live in a rural area like Long Island, there is a massive opioid problem. Like we have some of the worst overdose rates in the entire state. Like I went to high school with people that like I found out like years later, like they overdosed either on heroin or pills. So that kind of prompted like the motivation to just like educate myself like on the crisis. And when it came time to like write about a small town, it felt disingenuous not to address that this is like a very real problem and like the lived reality for people that this manufactured crisis in this country, and like how the role that like doctors played in it and the role that poverty plays in it and the recession and stuff. So I definitely wanted to like weave that into the story because it seemed it would have been like incredibly unrealistic if Samantha went back to this town and like didn't see how people she had grown up with were affected by it.
Mhm.
Yeah, that definitely such an accurate take on the drug crisis.
Mhm.
I think everybody I know has watched a friend fall to substance abuse, so definitely appreciate that being mentioned in there.
And if you haven't read or watched Dope Sick, because I've only watched the show Dope Sick, it's
Mhm.
The book is just as good.
Yeah, I feel like it would be hard. I mean, it's hard to read, so it'd probably be hard to watch too. But it's like, yeah, it's really well done and well researched.
yeah, Michael Keaton is the doctor character who
Mhm.
ends up addicted as well, and that's
Oh, man.
well. um, what besides what we just talked about? What do you hope that readers take away from Out of the Ashes?
I mean, first and foremost, like I always just want people to be surprised by my books. Like I feel like the day that I write a completely predictable book is like the day that I should just like, I don't know, find something else to do, like bake macarons for a living. That not that that's easy. But I always like the note that I always like to leave off on, like what I want readers to take away from it. I just don't want them to close the book and forget about it. I always want like some sort of dilemma or question at the end that like they have to go and talk to somebody about it who has already read it and like argue about it. Like, I can't believe she did that. And like the main character, it's like, well, I would have done the same thing. And it's like, you would have? Like, I just remember for me, that moment was like years and years ago when I watched Gone Baby Gone with my husband at the end. Like, we were just like arguing about the ending. I was like, I'm on Casey Affleck's side. He's like, I'm on Morgan Freeman's side. And I think it was actually like switched in that scenario. But I mean, like we were arguing about it for days. And that was just the moment where it's like, wow, this is actually what I want to do as a writer. Like, I want, like, not to like ruin people's week because they're fighting with their spouse about the controversial ending of my book, but those like thought provoking moral questions that
Mhm.
like you think you would know, you think you know what you would do in that situation, but if you actually were, like what would you do? Like I always want people to have to like put themselves like in that scenario and kind of like wonder like if they could be the worst version of themselves, or like maybe like maybe Sam made the right decision at the end. Like I mean, I obviously like have my own opinions about what she did and how I feel about it, but I know that other readers are going to feel differently, and I know that not everybody is going to agree. So I just want people to like be thinking about it when they're done reading it.
We've been thinking about it.
Nonstop.
Oh, good.
So many questions.
We'll have to have the spoiler chat follow up.
Yeah. So are you working on anything currently, and can you tell us about it?
Yeah. I'm working on several things, several overdue things.
Aren't we all?
That yes, but I mean they are like in the like moving forward stages to the point where like I can say that they will both be out next year. The first is going to be out next spring. It's another book for adults. It is called Lost to Dune Road, and if you live on Long Island or familiar with the Hamptons, you know what Dune Road is. But it's about a journalist who her career and personal life is thrown into chaos when she is following a missing persons case of a girl who disappeared on Dune Road, and the killer calls the journalist from the missing girl's cell phone. And it just like destroys this journalist's life. And then 5 years later, as she's trying to put the pieces of her life back together, there is a related case that sucks her back in. So that is my next novel for adults. I'm also revising my next YA. I'm not leaving YA. I just needed like a little bit of a breather from YA, but it was a good decision because I'm like actually legitimately ridiculously excited about my next YA. I can't say too much about it, but it is set in the same world as one of my previous YA books. So like I am hesitant to call it, it's not a sequel. I'm also hesitant to call it a companion novel. It's a companion novel. I just can't say to which book. And that will be out next year too, just date and time to be determined by when I finish it.
Exciting.
Oh.
I'm very excited for another adult novel from you.
Oh, I'm glad.
Yeah, and just from that brief synopsis, I'm like, yes, what?
What I can share about it is that when I sent my editor the outline, her feedback was, I don't want this to be too much darker than Out of the Ashes. And I was like, wait, did you read Out of the Ashes? You think this one is darker? Yeah, so interpret that how you will.
One other question we always like to ask is, can readers get signed copies of your books anywhere?
Yes, absolutely. The best way to get like an actual like signed personalized copy is through the Next Chapter bookstore. So their website is thenextchapterli.com. You can order it online, put a note in checkout what you want the personalization to be. You could call the store to order it. I will be signing those at the launch party on May 18th. So if you live out of state, they will ship after May 18th. If you live locally, you could pick it up free from the store. You also, for anybody anywhere that has ordered a copy of my book, if you just direct message me on Instagram, like a screenshot of your mailing address and proof of purchase, I will send you a signed bookplate. It's not the same as like a signed book, but that is always an option. Like if you have already ordered it, like from your local bookstore, but you want that signed copy. But yeah, the bookstore again is called The Next Chapter, Long Island.
Yeah, we'll put the link in the chat when it uploads.
Cool.
And does all its crazy internet web things.
And then our final question is, if you had one piece of writing advice to give to somebody who is just starting their journey, what would it be?
I always lately I have been telling people like you can never, once you become a published author, you can't unpublish yourself. Like once that train has left the station, it has left the station. So if I could go back and tell myself before I was published to just like kind of enjoy when I was able to just write for myself, when like, I mean, it's obviously incredible to be able to make a living out of this, but having to share your work with other people sometimes before you even read it, to have to like justify it, like, okay, this is the next book I want to write, like do you want to buy it before I write it? The business side of things, while it is like it can be like a lifelong dream to have your book published and get it out in the world, like I often miss when I was just writing for myself and writing whatever the hell I wanted without any sort of expectation that anybody would read it one day. So I think it's an amazing, valid goal to want to be published. I think most people that write do want to be published, but I would just say, like, wherever you are in the journey, remember what that feels like when you're just writing for yourself, because there will be moments that you'll have to revisit that or remind yourself why you love to do it.
I love that.
Yeah.
Kara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys.
Yes. We definitely want to have you back next year for the next one. And
definitely, yeah.
And maybe we'll get into spoilers of this one at that time. Who knows?
Yes, I love spoiler chats. I love when people like yell at me too. Like, bring it on. That's my favorite.
I don't want to yell at you, but I want some answers.
Yeah. Just needs answers.
Thank you guys so much.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, The Nest, for being here. Our next author chat is happening on Saturday, May 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern, and it will be with Kelly McWilliams, who is the author of Your Plantation Prom is Not Okay. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.